Hello, everyone. I think we are now live. Thank you so much for joining our session. I believe this is the final session of the Cultivate Africa event. So if I could just ask for our slides to be broadcast now. Thank you very much. So as I said, thank you so much for joining. We will be discussing digital data today. So our session is called Riding the Digital Data Wave, Barriers and Innovation in Agricultural Data Sharing. Quickly, I'll introduce myself. My name is Victoria Claus. I'm a senior technology and agriculture expert working with the Mercy Corps AgriFin program. I'm based here in sunny Nairobi in Kenya. And I'll just run through our other presenters and speakers today, but I won't go into too much detail. I'll ask them to introduce themselves as they speak. So we're very pleased to have Christine Ribeiro from ISF Advisors, who will be presenting to us today. And then on our panel discussion, we have Rose Goslinger, who is the founder and co-CEO of Pula. We have Christophe Bouquet, who is the senior project manager with Dalberg Data Insights, and David Hughes, who is an associate professor in entomology and biology at Penn State University and the founder of Plant Village. So thank you again to all our speakers. I'll just quickly look through the agenda so that we have an idea of what we'll be tackling today. Christine Ribeiro will open with a presentation for around 10 minutes, taking us through some of the trends and barriers that we've seen in our work with Mercy Corps AgriFin in different African markets, working with smallholder farmers. And then following that, we'll pick up on some of the insights and the discussion points during our panel with the three speakers that I've mentioned. So just to note that throughout the presentation and the panel, please do note your questions down for either Christine or for the panelists throughout the discussion. I think if you can post them in the comments box, then we will be able to address those at the end. So we want this to try and make this an interactive session. So please do think of some questions for us. Great. So I'll just give a quick background to Mercy Corps and the AgriFin program. So we are based out of Nairobi and a reasonably small team. We're funded by the MasterCard Foundation and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We've worked with a number of different partners and organizations across the private and public sector. In fact, we've worked with over 130 partners across Africa. We work with scale partners such as banks, mobile network operators, agribusinesses, tech innovators, and governments. Our model is really to work closely with these organizations and to develop digitally enabled services for smallholder farmers. So our model is to design, test, and scale these services. And so there's so much information on our website, so I'd really encourage you to go to the website after the session if you have further questions. And we don't have enough time to go into too much detail, but one of the areas that we have been working on a lot within AgriFin and working closely with our partners is around data sharing. And so I think I will now introduce Christine on the next slide, who is going to take us through a piece of work that she's been leading in partnership with the AgriFin team to look really at the different trends and barriers across multiple partners in our portfolio of African countries and what these kind of common trends are when it comes to sharing agricultural data. So I'll pass over to Christine, and then as I said, if you do have questions, please note them down in the comments box, and we will then move on to the panel discussion. Thanks, Christine.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. As Victoria mentioned, I am with ISF Advisors. So it's an advisory group that promotes financial inclusion for smallholder farmers. And we have been working jointly with Mercy Corps on analyzing some of their work around data sharing to draw broader lessons for the ecosystem. And so I'm going to go into a little bit about that. We have a learning brief that will be coming out shortly as well with much more detail. So AgriFin's experience has been going on for a number of years, and increasingly they've been seeing data sharing and data partnerships emerging as a space within agriculture. In fact, 25% of all of their engagements had a data sharing component. And what they have seen is that these data sharing partnerships are still at very early stages. Partners are not sure how to move forward, often unsure about their data. So they wanted to look at sort of the trends and barriers that had been happening to help others learn how to move forward and help the sector move forward in this. In looking at their engagements, about 70% of them involved tech companies as either one or both of the partners that were sharing data. And the data was used often for credit scoring to give loans to farmers, targeting trainings so that farmers would get the appropriate content that they needed. And then an area that they've sort of moved into recently is open access to information, working with governments to make data available to spur innovation across the ecosystem. And as I already mentioned, it's early on in data sharing for agriculture. The types of data, the way that it's being shared via static Excel reports, and some of the sophistication in the analysis for a lot of the partners is still very early on. And so we're hoping that this research will help move everyone forward to use data and help smallholder farmers. And thinking about how data plays a role in agriculture, we're seeing across sectors a trend of big data. There's more data out there. Our lives are being more and more digitized, creating data points around all of our behaviors, as well as new technologies, satellites and drones and others that are providing data points that are relevant to learn more about farmers. And learning about individual farmers can often be costly, especially in the African context where they're remote and dispersed. To collect data on an individual level requires quite a lot of field work. And so having this digitized data that comes together allows private companies to understand farmers as a client better, be able to segment farmers, to be able to tailor products to meet farmer needs, and just help to move the agricultural space to be more productive. In the development space, another area that's being focused on is access to open data, which I mentioned. Often it's governments and NGOs that are pushing this, but making data sets more open so that that data is available for private companies to innovate on, as well as to create policies that really impact the farmers they're trying to serve. In looking at AgriFin's portfolio and across those engagements, there are really three types of service delivery models that they work with. A multilateral service provision, which is typically 2 or 3 service providers that are coming together and sharing data around specific farmers that they're working with jointly. Platforms, which have many service providers coming together and bundling services. And then open data initiatives, which are these open data hubs where you can get access to public data. Now, these 3 types each come with different nuances on the type of data and the way it's shared. So, for example, multilateral services and platforms tend to be focused on farmer-level data. So getting insights on individuals' behaviors and actions to be able to do tailored services. Whereas open data initiatives, given the open nature, do not tend to share private personal data around individuals. And the data tends to be much broader, location-based, crop-based, aggregated data, so you can get more general findings, but not farmer-specific insights. And in terms of the sharing mechanisms, platforms tend to be much more advanced in terms of technology, building APIs for real-time integration. And part of that is because they have multiple partners which they can spread this investment across, whereas the others are sort of smaller partnership relationships where that investment might not make as much sense. But it also means that their data is not as real time, allowing for less decision-driven models. And so a summary of the learnings that we found when looking across these models was, the first is that a lot of these partners are at a very early stage in understanding data. They might not understand the data they even hold internally. Different departments are not talking to each other, even within their own institution, to know what data they have that they could be utilizing. So even thinking about partnering with someone else, they don't even know where to begin with what data they have or what data that they need. as they move forward in thinking about data and what they could be using data for and what particular use cases data could be used for, there is a difficulty in understanding the business case. How do they measure the return on investment for this data? How do they value that data? How would others see that data? And how can they make that case? Because data involves cost. You have to collect it, you have to store it, you have to analyze it. You need the capacities of the people, the software, all of that. So you need to be very specific on what the use case is going to be for that data, and to have the institution give the funding to be able to do that, you need to make the business case for that, to show the impact that it will have on the business or on the farmers, depending on what the institution is going for. And these costs are not only related to the data itself, but also the data sharing agreement negotiations. These can take some time. You have to go through a lot of specific details around who owns the data, where is the data going to sit, what can it be used for. And as it's very early on for a lot of these companies, they're still trying to figure that out. In addition, the national regulations around data are continuing to emerge. And so making sure that you're aligned with that requires resources and capabilities as well that many of the partners do not have in-house. And then before even looking at getting involved in a data partnership, an institution needs to reflect to make sure that they are ready. So AgriFin and ISF have designed a data readiness assessment framework and tool, which looks across the availability of data, data management, policies and procedures, and the people and their capabilities, with specific indicators around that to help identify if an institution is even ready to move forward with data sharing. Have you figured out how data is managed internally and have those policies and procedures in place? Do you really have the capacity to move forward? And with those in place, you can maximize the benefit of data sharing arrangements. As mentioned, the regulatory and compliance landscape is changing, and countries are coming up with new regulations. Often, because they're new, interpretation is a bit vague by the partners. So making sure that they're aligned on their interpretation sometimes means having legal counsel or even directly talking to the regulators themselves to make sure that the data sharing is in alignment with regulations. And while these use cases are popping up and still growing, there are a number of other organizations who have been putting out literature and doing research around principles and standards and toolkits to help within the agricultural sector to move this forward, with AgriFin being one of them, and their newest learning brief being part of this. And there's been particular focus around open data initiatives and how to get involved in open data initiatives, both for the public and the private sector. And one of the other areas that we go into detail in the learning brief is these 5 broad categories that appeared of barriers to data sharing. So capacity, commercial, cultural, regulatory, and reputational. Each of these has subcategories, but what's interesting is that each of these different barriers comes at different points throughout the process of data sharing. Some are more apparent given the type of partner. If it's an MNO or FSP, for example, regulatory issues come into play quite a bit. The type of data that's being shared, if it's personal or non-personal in nature, also makes quite a big difference, and what you're using the data for. And so understanding when those barriers are more likely to emerge can help partners to mitigate them early and to move forward and help these partnerships to go faster and benefit both the institutions and farmers in the end. And so the learning brief, I don't have time to go into all of it here, but you'll be able to see that. And then also highlighted from the analysis was that there was not a common language to talk about data in agriculture. There had been some attempts, but no uniform acceptance of any kind of taxonomy of what counts as a data type, a data use case, and the characteristics of data within agriculture. So we worked on developing that based on the experience of AgriFin. We also worked on, as I mentioned, a data readiness assessment. So this is a high-level framework of what needs to be in place to make sure that your institution is ready to move forward. And there is actually a tool to help assess your readiness that is being piloted by AgriFin with a few partners. And then the data sharing process, which is a step-by-step guide, and each step showing what the common barriers are and the key learnings based on the engagements that AgriFin has gone through to help others identify those early, look which stage they're in, and see what makes the most sense for them in moving forward. And then finally, the additional resources. As I mentioned, there are a number of other organizations who have been working on setting up toolkits and guides around data sharing in agriculture. And we have a compilation of these resources, of AgriFin's resources and other partners to help move the sector forward in data sharing. So thank you for that. And back to Victoria.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Christine. That was brilliant. Lots of fantastic insights there. And as I think you mentioned already, that learning brief will be available on our website in the next couple of weeks. So at the end of this session, there'll be a slide with my email address and our website where you'll be able to register for our newsletter and be alerted to when that is ready. But thanks again, Christine. And if we can now turn to the next slide for our panel discussion. We've already briefly introduced the panelists, but I will just ask them to give a quick introduction to themselves and their organization before we get into the questions. So over to you, Rose.
Good afternoon. My name is Rose Goslinga, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pula.
Thanks, Rose. Would you mind just telling just one sentence on what Pula is for the audience?
Sure. At Pula, we develop, in one nutshell sentence, we develop agriculture insurance for smallholder farmers. We work across 13 countries in Africa. This year, we're on track to develop insurance products for about 2 million farmers across those markets. We're not an insurance company. We are what they call an insurtech these days. So we partner together with insurance companies and support them to enable products. We price them, do the claims handling, do the actuarial analysis. And then we also don't actually sell insurance directly to farmers. We actually partner together with large institutions, whether they're seed fertilizer companies or central banks, that actually get products out to farmers. So that in a nutshell is what we do.
Perfect, thank you. And Christophe and David, if you could also just give a quick introduction to yourselves and your organization.
Great, Christophe, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you, David. I hope you can hear me well. Hi, everyone. My name is Christophe. I'm project manager at Dalberg. I'm based out of Nairobi. And Dalberg is a management consulting firm, and more precisely, I'm from the data science entity of the Dalberg Group. Really pleased to be here with you today. Over to you, David.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. So my name is David Hughes. I'm an associate professor of entomology and biology at Penn State University and also the founder of Plant Village. And Plant Village is a platform that helps smallholder farmers cope with the stresses of pests and climate change. We're a partner with UNFAO through an MOU. We operate an AI-first platform for FAO across 60 countries on 3 transboundary pests, including the locust crisis. We're also partners with Medea Company and Mercy Corps in East Africa, currently reaching about 14 million farmers a week through advisories on climate smart agriculture and pests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So let's get straight to the questions. Christine's presentation, she mentioned some of the common challenges or barriers when it comes to data sharing in the agriculture sector specifically. So we had about capacity, cultural, commercial, regulatory, and reputational barriers. I'm just interested from your perspective, Rose, working for a long time in the African market. At Pula, what are the major barriers you're facing at Pula when it comes to data sharing?
Look, I think, when we collect a lot of customer data, and then we collect a lot of yield data. And I think we approach the two different data sets quite differently. When we look at the customer data, often, we're working together with a seed or fertilizer company, and we're kind of the agent that is out there collecting the data, but it's not really our data and it's not really our customer. And like in the beginning, like when we started working on this, we said, well, we're collecting it. We've found very efficient ways of collecting it. But in the end, they don't really know us. They're really buying a bag of seed. And we used to argue really hard over this. And if I look back at it, I probably shouldn't have argued so hard over it, because in the end, if it's not, the data is ours, but the customer doesn't know us, and, they don't really find, it's, we can't really use it and really make that data come alive, even though we might know a lot and we might be very smart about, or think even that we can be smarter about everybody else and like in constructing and analyzing the data. I think the reality is in these kind of environments is that we've come to look at this as like, okay, it's great if it sits with us, but if it's not going to be used with us, then what's the point? So we're fairly, I would say by now we're pretty open when it comes to like the customer data, like personal data. Like, of course, there's the data policies that you have to adhere to. But often it's really, who does the customer know? If you're working together with an MNO, if you're working together with an MNO, the MNO will, they're the ones who are on the front end. And so like, you come up with data sharing agreements, and I think the key thing is to look at, like in most of the companies that we work with, even the larger MNOs and multinationals, they most of the time even say, okay, well, look, even if it's our customer, we are holding, like we're at, the customer, we might be holding this data, but in the end, it's the customer's data. So it's like you're a custodian of the data, but it's not yours. So I think that's also very much in line with what we're seeing kind of in the market and in the kind of GDPR regulation. It's the customer who owns their data, and you might be collecting it. But it's a very tricky and touchy subject. So we've kind of become fairly open about it. I think a very different perspective we have on yield data, where we go out to the field and collect it. There, it's something that we need for our insurance products, and there we really find that there we tend to be a bit more protective and say, look, we went out there, collected this data for our purposes. We use it to price more insurance products in the future. And this is really part and core to our IP and our defensibility as a business. So like, it's something that we're generally much more concerned around, and definitely a certain amount of protection around that. Does that help?
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. I think the next question for David and Christoph is actually leads on perfectly from that. So I think when we talk about that, who owns the data, that's often been the one of the biggest barriers, I think, especially when there's been a lot of investment made to collect the data, whether it be yield data, customer data, location data. And so I wondered from David and Christoph's point of view, as you've both got a lot of experience working with open data initiatives, what role do you think the public sector organizations can play in facilitating more data sharing from the private sector? Maybe, David, you could start.
So the primary way is what they've been doing for many years, which is to grease the wheels by investing billions and billions of dollars in satellite systems from, say, NASA or European Space Agency. And this helps dramatically because it brings a lot of people in. So one of the tools that we use every day is a tool called Whopper from FAO, which is about a $30 or $40 million investment at this stage in order to use NASA satellites and various tools to look at above ground biomass, soil moisture, use of water, efficiency of water in the system, and stress and drought. And that's critically important. And the idea there was that it would bring players into the market. It hasn't worked in that way. So maybe in the public sector, there has to be a little bit more easing of the friction. I think the one thing that we've found throughout the locust crisis, as we've begun to work with private sector, particularly iShamba in Kenya, but also a little bit with some of One Acre Fund data, which is of course a charity, is just kind of making it easy for them to bring their data in so that we can analyze it and get results. Because quite often, particularly around SMS data or farmer use data, it's not well organized, and it's not useful in that case. So one of the things we've been doing is building tools for private enterprises so that they can reduce the cost in their call centers, get more people onboarded, and these are again useful takeaways that they can have, and it kind of inclines them more to share their data because they get something immediate. As always, no matter where we are, what space, it's always a chicken egg problem. You can't just expect somebody to give something without getting something immediately in return. I think that's what public and universities have to be really cognizant about, and certainly what we've learned in the locust crisis.
Great. And Christoph, in your experience as well, I know you've done a lot of work with ATA in Ethiopia and other or kind of public sector organizations.
Yeah, no, I think what David just shared is very much resonating with, let's say, our perspective, but also our experience. I think at the national level, of course, the public sector should be probably the one establishing a safe and really clear regulatory framework to enable and foster the data sharing in the agriculture space, but in other spaces as well. I believe today public health is also, or health as a whole, is also a very important topic, and there are intersections with agriculture as well. But then another point, and this is, I guess, very much connected with the point of David, is that I feel that some institutions and some public entities, such as ministries of agriculture or ministries of ICTs and the likes, can provide the public and the private sectors with data for agriculture public goods. And those public goods, they can range from fairly simple solutions, such as granular and timely weather and meteorological data, let's say. They can be a bit more complex, such as the one that David mentioned around satellite images, which requires a really high upfront cost, and there are very few private sector players that are actually providing that for free, and hence they are not really playing this role of foundational layer for other stakeholders to leverage that layer to reach out to farmers or other agri-businesses active along the agriculture value chains. And yeah, I think that the example of the Ethiopian Agriculture Transformation Agency is really good. We had the chance with the AgriFin Accelerate program to work with them and support in this implementation of what they call their public health data hub, which is another form a bit more complex of data for ag public goods, which is basically providing data generated by different digital systems used by about 6 million farmers to different parties in different forms in a safe and secured manner to help, again, other players from private or public sector to actually benefit from that data, and of course in respect with the ownership of the data, which is, I think, like Rose rightly put, in the end of the customers and users of those services.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much. Really interesting perspectives. I think that point around kind of data security and data privacy is obviously critical. I know that, David, in your work at Plant Village, you've got a lot of experience, and I know that the other panelists, Rose and Christoph, may be able to also add, but I was just interested to know around, when we're thinking about different innovation now that's coming up, to make it easier for organizations to share data securely, and that means what, protecting the privacy of the customers whose data is being shared. I know that with the rise of big data, and there have been concerns raised about smallholder farmers being, that they don't have necessarily the education around data protection to understand where the data is going. So just interested to know, what innovations are you seeing to kind of address that concern around data protection, data privacy?
So what we're looking at is taking an example from the medical community, particularly around something called federated learning. So medical data is highly private, particularly in hospitals where they wouldn't want it. They would be doing experiments, they'd be looking at patients and seeing regimes of use of drugs, but they would not want that data to go outside the hospital. But they would want to benefit from the cloud systems that enable machine learning, so looking for patterns in the data. And so an approach there is something called federated learning, where you can have the machine learning models being sent from a cloud system down to a system of distributed hubs, and they would be phones or local servers. They can also work on phones. And then the data stays on the phone or the local server, never goes to the cloud, but the model is running on that data. And then the model learns about how well it fits to the local data, goes back into the cloud, and then from that we can understand which model overall is better. So we, as a public, a global public good or a common space, can benefit from having all of this learning happening in a federated manner, and then the hospitals benefit by having the data being private. So this is a very successful system, and it's been well understood in computer science to be beneficial and as good as the older model. So I think this is going to be really important for agricultural spaces, and especially also places where we have intermediaries, like a private company like iShamba, who has a subscription service. They would not want to share some aspects of their data, or see DigiFarm in Kenya as well. And this would make them feel comfortable, allow them to have value add in the marketplace, and because they know other things about their customers, but also benefit from the models. And I also think it's really important that we move towards this, because we're dealing with climate change where nobody knows what's going to happen in a particular location at a particular time, and therefore the diagnostics must be transparent and open and public. And that's where I think there's a really important role for universities like Penn State, for public entities like UN and CGIR to be the ones who are working on these diagnostic systems, because we don't want to get to a situation where diagnostics is private, because that kind of leads to problems that we well understood elsewhere. You're muted, Victoria.
Sorry, there was someone banging a door in the background. Christophe or Rose, do you have anything else you'd like to add in terms of innovation around data protection?
Look, I think it's become more like, particularly with the penetration of smartphone usage at a agent level, like a lot of like things that would be otherwise quite difficult in terms of like informed consent have become a much easier thing to do. I think, if you look at, there is like, if a lot of our partners is in terms of large mobile network operators will say, you ask a customer, even before you access any service, do you accept terms and conditions, and, please click somewhere. And I think all of us on this call have clicked multiple times, I accept terms and conditions, and never read the actual terms and conditions. And we certainly see a lot of that happening. I think what we really try to do is when we try to get informed consent from our customers, is put a very kind of simple version of the terms and conditions out there, and that's definitely possible if you're using an agent, let's say an agro dealer, who is signing up a customer for, let's say in our case, an insurance service. You can, before you start the data collection process, have them tick off or sign off on this is what we're going to use your data for, and you can make it pretty simple what they're signing off for, if you have access to a smartphone. And we've really found that when agent smartphone usage, like our average agro dealer at this point, 85% of our agro dealers have a smartphone. So you can put a lot more rich data on there, and therefore get a lot more informed consent through that kind of channeling.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Christophe. I know you wanted to add something on this point.
Yeah, no, very quickly. I think because we are talking about innovation, and I personally like to decouple innovation and digital technology, because I think that today we tend to always mix them. But I believe that, for example, what Rose mentioned at the beginning of this panel, so the European General Data Privacy Regulation, according to my, let's say, standard, is an innovation innovation on its own, and is really setting the scene and establishing this safe and transparent and clear framework to enable the sharing of the data. So I do believe that this kind of innovation is actually really critical for what we are talking about today. Just referring to the country where I live, in Kenya, for example, after that this European regulation came out, they developed their own Data Privacy Act in 2019, so last year, which also helps a lot of different players to get a better understanding of what is actually what people can and cannot do with the data that we are talking about today. So I think, yeah, again, just wanted to re-mention that this kind of innovation, according to me, is also playing a critical role beyond the digital technology.
Yeah, definitely. I'd just like to, at this stage, ask, remind the audience who's watching, if you do have any questions, please put them in the comments box, and then we will receive them and ask them to the panelists. And if you have somebody in particular, please mention that in your question. I think going back to the question about public sector role and thinking through what Christophe and David said around building this, greasing the wheels, building the foundation layer. I know that ATA in Ethiopia is an excellent example of that in reality, but I think what I've seen in other countries is that it requires a lot of investment, and it also requires, I guess, the capacity in terms of those organizations being able to attract the right talent. And so I just wondered if you have any comments on how ATA in Ethiopia has managed to overcome that particular issue with, within public sector, possibly not always being able to access the talent, let's say, that private sector has access to.
Yeah, so I'm happy to give a quick perspective on this one. Again, according to my own experience, what I've seen is that usually there is a lot of effort that is put, especially from a financial perspective, that is put at the early stage of the design and early development and potentially also early implementation of this kind of data and digital public goods. But we see a lot of challenges when it comes to establish the right, I would say, ecosystem to maintain and sustain those efforts on the longer term. And I do believe that the Ethiopian Agriculture Transformation Agency succeeded in actually establishing this ecosystem to maintain and sustain this effort on the longer term. So this is something that has been running for several years now. They had the time to build the core components of a proper data for agriculture public goods. So both the human capacity, but also the technical infrastructure, and then the financials, of course, as well as raising the awareness and having the time to properly connect with all the farmers who are today benefiting of the digital services that they are offering for free. So to that respect, I do believe that the ATA example is a success and is probably a bit different in a good way from what we see in other geographies.
Brilliant.
I could add 2 cents here. I think it's actually quite cheap to build these systems. I think a lot of donors, we're working with the Gates Foundation a lot, but also with NORAD and also CJR. They often think of having to build this huge platform, one platform to rule them all. And they spent a lot of time getting a lot of people in a room, and it's sort of death by committee. I think if we think about it from the other perspective and look at the successes globally in terms of these data-driven approaches, you think about Airbnb, Uber, WhatsApp, and things like Snapchat. So WhatsApp, when it was sold for $1 billion, it was undervalued 10 times. It only had 13 staff. When Snapchat was sold for $44 billion, it had 23 staff. So the ability to run these large platforms with a low number of people because of automation is absolutely present. So one of the things we're working on at Plant Village is something called Ag3, Algorithmic Agriculture agricultural advice, to make it really easy. And we're working with ATA as well as the Kenyan government, to have a system that can be cheap by design and then sustainable because it's just low cost, but also, and this is critically important, a really kind of a mission statement of Plant Village, because we engage so many African youth and Kenyan youth in our efforts, is that we need to be training computer scientists in country, and because we're a university, that's kind of easy for us to do, and that means that we can easily hand over. Where it becomes unsustainable is where we have a model of, say, a European-based entity or US-based entity, which is constantly having to come in to fix things. We've seen on the continent for 40 years how that is a bad model. And so I just would like to leave people with the message that given the affordability of computing power, data systems, architecture, and cloud systems, it's quite cheap and easy now. We have many, many examples of that, and we should definitely take those and transpose them into agricultural surveillance, diagnostics, and farm services.
Really interesting. Thanks, David. I know that we don't have any questions coming in from the audience, but we have lots of material, amongst the panelists that we'd love to discuss in the last few minutes. I think we've probably got time for one final question. I think I wanted to pick up on the point about that Rose had touched on when it comes to the different types of data there are. So you have your yield data and your customer data. So I think obviously there is a cost to building up large database, large data sets of different agricultural data, whether it's farmer data for credit scoring or let's say training data or validation data for different satellite-based models. You mentioned, because it's your investment and your IP around the yield data. Do you think there's any role the public sector can play in there in terms of, or what would be your ask to, let's say, the Cultivate Africa audience around how to scale that, how to make it easier to build up that data set, basically?
Of course, it would be ideal if it was public. I think the whole reason, we also use a whole bunch of public yield data. Like, for example, we use the FAO stat, we use WFP has a fantastic FAM database that we use. I think the key point to us is if you want to have for our particular product, which is it's kind of like our customers are looking for a very granular yield insurance, and they're looking for an insurance, the time to pay. If we would take 6 to 9 months to pay our customer, our product would, we'd get so many complaints, and we would be, people would make fun of us, let's put it that way. So key for us has been the speed of delivering a yield outcome and therefore an insurance payout. And the granularity of that data. Now, if the government, we definitely see that in some countries, the government is able to provide this kind of service. So, for example, in India, the government every year does a huge effort in actually putting this data out there. It does take about a year and a half to 2 years to. It does take about a year and a half to 2 years to get the data, and that's also the main complaint from farmers. It takes such a long time. We once did a pilot in India where it took us 3 months to pay, and we were embarrassed because usually it takes us about a month, and we were like, customers are going to be so upset, and they're like, wow, this was so fast, and we were like, okay. You're not angry? No, this is amazing. And we're like, okay. So it's really about different expectations, because in the countries where we work, if we take 3 months, our customers are like, why did you take 3 months? Because they expect you to do it in 2 weeks, frankly. So I think it's really about expectations and it's about reliability. So I think, if government is, surely it is a government function to put out yield data there. Fantastic. Should we wait for governments like African governments or Asian governments that don't have that? Should we wait for that insurance product to be available until that government service is there and say, actually, you can't offer the service because we think that this is a government ordained, public sector function to do? I'm very happy to have a debate with somebody around that we shouldn't be collecting yield data. And, my perspective on it is we're providing a valued service to people and they're willing to pay for it.
Absolutely.
So
Rose, I'm afraid we're already at the end of the session. It's gone so fast. I know that they're about to shut us off, so I just wanted to leave the audience with the Mertico AgriFin website up there where you can sign up to our newsletter. And if you'd like to send me an email directly to request those resources that Christine had mentioned earlier in the presentation. But finally, before we do close, I'd really like to say a big thank you to all our panelists. Christine, thank you so much for taking the time to put together those insights. And the panelists, it's been really interesting to get your insights and start this discussion. I know it was very short, but just thank you so much to everybody. And we hope that the audience will get in contact if you have further questions.
Great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.